Hello everyone and welcome back to another recorded lecture of AP1. Today we will talk about the brain, which is the topic of chapter 14. So, talk about the brain. And there's a very interesting little introduction to the brain in the book I suggest you read on page 505. But if we had to simplify what the brain really is, it's a central processor. Right? So it's a processing machine and it's a director. So it directs the nervous system among other organ systems. And what the brain does best is receive information from the outside world and then filter that information to send what's necessary to the right place at the right time. I compared the cell membrane to a brain in the beginning of the course because the membrane has that same type of function. It can receive materials from the outside world, but it also filters out what's not needed. And what is needed needs to be directed to the proper place in the cell at the right time. So the membrane does for the cell what the brain does for organisms like us. And consciousness, thought, memory, learning, emotions, and language all reside in the brain. So what makes us human, right, really resides in the brain. And a little fun fact, the human brain specifically, is the only known organ to be aware of itself. So think about it. No other organ on this planet is aware of its own existence except the human brain. And so much so we can study our own organ, our own brain, in this talk. So there are 4 regions of the brain, and different books divide them up a little differently, but we're going to go with this textbook and say that there are 3 regions that include the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So the book says those are those 3. And the book classifies, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just want you to say there are really, most books would say there are 4 different regions, but the book says there are 3 major regions. The cerebrum is the most obvious feature. This is the cerebrum over here, and it's about 80% of the brain's volume is just the cerebrum. And you can see very prominently gyri and sulci. So gyri are these folds. This is a gyrus. So this part is the gyrus. It's like the fold part. And the sulci are the grooves. So this is the sulcus. Those are so really, again, you'll hear gyri and gyri as 2 possible plurals for gyrus, and you'll hear sulci or sulci for plural of sulcus. But it's always a sulcus and it's always a gyrus. So that's the most prominent feature of the brain. That's the first thing you see is the cerebrum. So it's 80% of the brain. The biggest, we'll see other features of the cerebrum in just a bit. The cerebellum comes next, and that's at the posterior portion of the brain. And this right over here is called the transverse cerebral fissure. So that's what demarks the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is the second largest region of the brain. It's about 10% of the overall volume. So the cerebrum was 80%, the cerebellum was about 10%. But what's amazing is that it contains 50% of all the brain's neurons. So the cerebellum has half of all the brain's neurons, but only takes up about 10% of the volume. So that just tells you how dense the neurons are packed in the cerebellum. And then we have the brainstem, which the book says includes the Diencephalon. So that's my little asterisk that I tried to mention over here. So the brainstem is defined differently by different books, but the brainstem was originally thought to be everything that's not the cerebrum and cerebellum. but we know that there's a part inside that's called the Diencephalon, and that's pretty distinct from the brainstem. But the brainstem itself, we'll see, has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So those are the major regions of the brain. When we discuss the brain, we don't use the terms anterior and posterior. We use the two directional terms rostral and caudal. And rostral literally means toward the nose. Caudal means toward the tail. So we're going to use these terms for the human brain. So rostral just means anything toward the forehead. And caudal means toward the spinal cord, because we don't have a tail. All right. So we're going to say rostral is toward the forehead in the terms of the brain, toward the forehead or closer to the nose, literally. And caudal is closer to the spinal cord, which is lower. So those are the directional terms. And in this image, you can see the cerebrum, which takes 80% of the volume. This is the cerebrum from here all the way here. Then we have the transverse cerebral fissure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then we have the diencephalon and the brainstem over here. So far you should be acquainted. Brainstem, cerebellum, cerebrum, diencephalon. So make sure you're comfortable with those terms. The central sulcus. The central sulcus is a very prominent landmark on the brain. So the central sulcus over here, think about what kind of suture, what kind of section that would make. So what kind of section, if I cut along the central sulcus, think about what kind of section that would make. Right, and you would make a coronal section or a frontal section. The lateral sulcus is over here. So the lateral sulcus marks where the temporal lobe is compared to where the frontal lobe is, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You have two gyri that are on either side of the central sulcus. You have the post-central gyrus. So remember, the gyrus is a groove. So this is the post-central gyrus, and then you have over here the pre-central gyrus. And if you wanted to use anatomical terms, right, we can say that the pre-central gyrus is rostral to the post-central gyrus. But we wouldn't really say anterior and posterior or proximal distal. So I think I mentioned everything I want you to know for there. So just to test your memory, the precentral gyrus is blank to the postcentral gyrus. So the answer is precentral is rostral. Okay. So the brain and the spinal cord are both made of neurons and their supporting cells, the neuroglia, and they form either gray matter or white matter. So gray matter is the cell bodies of the neurons and the dendrites, the synapses that they form. So we could look over here at the section of the brain. This is a frontal section view of the brain. And you can see that the cortex, the cerebral cortex, is all gray matter, right? So the outer layer of gray matter on the brain is called the cerebral cortex. And that gray matter has all the neurons' cell bodies and dendrites. The white matter on the inside consists of axons. So that lies deep to the cortical gray matter. And the white matter is mostly made of the axons. It's composed of tracts, what they're called. Tracts are bundles of axons. So the white matter has all the axons that transmit the nerve impulses from one brain region along these to another brain region. So they basically connect one part of the brain to another and also to the spinal cord. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but know that white matter is the axons or the tracts, the gray matter are the neuronal bodies and the synapses. So the CNS is a very precious part of our body and we need adequate protection. So we have bones that protect our central nervous system, like the cranial bones that protect our brain. We have vertebrae that protect our spinal cord. We also have meninges. So meninges are something that we spoke about very briefly in the context of connective tissue, I believe. So meninges are what protect the membranes that protect our brain. They envelop our brain and they provide a structural framework for all arteries and veins to nourish our brain. So the meninges are the membranes covering the brain and the spinal cord, and there are 3 layers of this membrane that surround the brain and spinal cord. From deep to superficial, there's the pia mater, which directly touches the brain. You have arachnoid mater, and then dura mater. So those are the 3 layers. And again, this is what has the blood vessels. You can see in the arachnoid space, there's some blood vessels here that nourish the brain, nourish the neurons. And you might have heard of meningitis, which is a disorder that is a result of inflammation of the meninges. So when this is a very serious disease, it could be either viral or bacterial. So usually they invade by the respiratory system. And then they get inside of the pia mater or the arachnoid mater, and they could spread. So once the bacteria infect or the virus infects the pia or arachnoid mater, it can actually spread to the neurons, and that's where it gets dangerous because the brain can swell up from meningitis, and that can cause hemorrhaging. So that's why meningitis is very deadly. And what we have to do to diagnose meningitis is do a spinal tap. You have to go by lumbar puncture to get some CSF, some cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk about that right now. And you would look for any remnants of either bacteria, if it's a bacterial infection, or you could look at the immune cells. You could look at the white blood count and see if the body was fighting off an infection. So meningitis is usually caused by viral or bacterial infection of the upper respiratory pathway. And here's a really nice image of the meninges in a frontal section of the skull. So here's the skull. Right beneath the skull, we have the dura mater. There are 2 sublayers to the dura mater, but we won't talk about those now. Beneath the dura mater, we have the arachnoid mater, and that's where all the blood vessels are, and the arachnoid mater. Then you have again, more blood vessels. Then you have the pia mater. And this is showing you this, over here, the subdural space. That's the space in between the dura and the arachnoid. And the subarachnoid space is the space in between the arachnoid and the pia. So you have these spaces as well. So cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, is what helps cushion, nourish, and protect the CNS. So all this space that you see is in blue, that's the CSF. That's specifically, this is the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. And it's filled with CSF. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So we have 4 spaces within the brain called ventricles that are filled with CSF. So we have most prominently 2 lateral ventricles, seen here. So these 2 lateral ventricles are connected to a third ventricle, and this is connected to the lateral ventricles by the interventricular foramen. I like this anterior view a little better because you can see these are the 2 lateral ventricles, and they connect to the third ventricle over here via the interventricular foramen. So it's like a hole. It's a space that allows the lateral ventricles to connect to the third ventricle. And then we have finally a fourth ventricle that's by the cerebellum, by the brainstem. So it's specifically between the pons of the brainstem and the cerebellum. And then finally, it leaves through an aperture to reach the central canal, which goes into the spinal cord. So it's called cerebrospinal fluid because the central canal of the spinal cord goes all the way down, and we need to nourish all those neurons of the spinal cord as well. So where does the CSF come from? So see if you can remember from the last class, what type of cell can make cerebrospinal fluid? And if you said ependymal cells, good job. So there's a bundle of capillaries in each ventricle called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus. So it's a bundle of capillaries in each ventricle that can secrete cerebrospinal fluid. And what allows them to do this is because they're lined with those special ependymal cells. And those ependymal cells can filter the blood plasma from the capillaries into CSF. So cerebrospinal fluid is made from the blood plasma, and it could go and then circulate. So it gets filtered. That's the first. It filters blood into the CSF. And then that CSF could circulate through the ventricles and the meninges. So this is going to protect the brain. It's going to insulate it in case the head is jolted a little bit. It also rinses out any metabolic wastes from the nervous tissue, and it makes sure that there's the right amount of sugar and the right pH balance inside the brain. Another way to think about how the cerebrospinal fluid helps the brain structure is it allows the brain to almost like float in a way. It doesn't really sink or float, but it hangs from the arachnoid mater in such a way that it doesn't put as much tension on our neck. So the way that the brain sits in the meninges, covered with the cerebrospinal fluid, it creates this type of buoyancy that doesn't allow us to be weighed down as much. So this buoyancy allows the brain to be really large without being impaired by its own size, right? Because if it rested on the floor of the cranium, then you would destroy all the nervous structure. You would press on the cerebellum, for example. The CSF is reabsorbed into the blood at arachnoid granulations. So I'll explain where that is in a bit. So let's go through this trace of CSF. The details of this won't be on the exam, so I'm going to talk about it very quickly. We said that the CSF is secreted by the choroid plexus and the lateral ventricles. It flows through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. There's a separate choroid plexus, separate ependymal cells that are going to make more CSF. Then that CSF goes down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, which is right over here, remember, between the pons and the cerebellum. That CSF will be added again. There's another choroid plexus over here that adds more CSF. And then it goes through 2 apertures, which are just fancy words for spaces. So it goes through these 2 apertures, these 2 little spaces, where it could then fill the subarachnoid space and nourish the entirety of the brain. And then there are special places called arachnoid villi, where the CSF is reabsorbed into the venous blood, and it could be returned to the heart and, again, reestablish the right balance of blood plasma. So now we understand how the brain is supported and nourished. We can start talking about the brain regions. So let's start with the brain stem, the most primitive part of the brain, the brain stem. So the brain stem has 3 components, and this is what connects the brain to the spinal cord. So there are 3 parts of the brainstem. Within the brainstem, we have the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. So we have 3 structures within the brainstem. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Here within the book, the book defines the brainstem a little differently. The book says the brainstem is everything that's not the cerebellum and cerebrum. I'm not going to give you a tricky question on the exam about this, just to be extra fair. But in most books, and I would imagine if you take like a standardized test, the brainstem consists of the medulla, pons, and the midbrain, and the diencephalon is something a little different. So we have the brainstem is what we're going to talk about now. And the brainstem is the most primitive part of the brain. So it's involved in unconscious reflexes and regulation of homeostasis. So we'll see the brainstem along with the hypothalamus is what controls our unconscious reflexes and our unconscious responses. And the brainstem is going to help us regulate blood pressure. So it has a vasomotor center in the medulla. Also, the cardiac center could help control our heart rate. We have a respiratory center, and the pons is what helps control our breathing. So the pons is responsible for breathing. Swallowing, coughing, and sneezing, all these very primitive things that we need to do are also found in the brainstem. So things that we need to just function, we need to breathe, we need to pump blood, we need to be able to swallow food, and coughing and sneezing are basic unconscious reflexes. We can't control that. That's all residing in the brainstem. The brainstem is also part of the relay station between the spinal cord and the thalamus. So the thalamus is part of the diencephalon, and the thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. So before any information gets to the thalamus from the spinal cord, you have to go through the brainstem. So the brainstem relays sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus. There is a structure called the Reticular Formation, and it's not just one structure. It's a network of structures, gray matter specifically, that runs vertically through all levels of the brainstem. So there are over 100 of these small neural networks. They're less anatomical as they are similar by which neurotransmitters they use. So they're not literal structural things that you can see by dissecting. There are structures that are spread out throughout the brainstem. That's shown over here in this bracket. So it's a formation of different neuronal bodies that kind of are all connected. And why the reticular formation is important is because it allows information from our eyes and our ears to be integrated by the rest of the brain. So it takes our auditory input from our ears, it takes visual input from our eyes, And it kind of puts them all together and tells our brain a more complete story. So the reticular formation is what helps send sensory information to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, it can then radiate to the cerebral cortex to the right place. So again, the reticular formation are very important. They help mediate our overall consciousness level about what we see and what we hear. The cerebellum is a very important part of this as well. So the reticular formation helps tell the cerebellum what is going on in front of our eyes and what we're hearing. So there's a lot I could go into about that, but for now I want you to understand that the reticular formation helps connect the spinal cord, the cerebellum, and the cerebellum to the cerebrum. So it takes sensory input and helps the thalamus communicate that message with the rest of the cerebrum. It also helps our sleep cycle, our level of awareness. It also, so again, this means how alert we are. And if you damage your reticular formation, you might have a irreversible coma, for example. There's also motor control and posture. So in short, the reticular formation helps keep our posture by inhibiting certain muscles from moving sometimes, and it allows our it allows the muscle tension to be just right so we can stay balanced when we do some body movements. So the reticular formation helps communicate what's going on outside with our cerebellum, which is very important for balance and posture. The reticular formation includes the vasomotor, cardiac, and respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata, which is over here. So the reticular formation is very complex. It also has other roles in pain modulation and habituation, and how we learn to ignore repetitive stimuli. So if you're in a very loud city, every day you stop hearing all the noise outside because you get habituated. So next up we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum, which is at the more caudal part of the brain. It's what controls our balance and posture and muscle coordination. So originally it was thought to be, well, it was just discovered relatively recently. So until the 50s, we had no idea what the cerebellum did. And up until very recently, it was thought to only control balance and posture. And that was because people with damage to the cerebellum had very jerky and uncoordinated movements. But the cerebellum also evaluates sensory input, as we just mentioned, right? So the reticular formation helps send the sensory input from our eyes and ears to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum can then decide what to do with that information as well. So this information could be tactile, things you touch, spatial, temporal, meaning time-wise, linguistic, or emotional. So let me explain a little bit more about what this means. When you feel something, when you're touching something physical, your cerebellum is highly activated. So something in 3D. Spatial perception is also residing in the cerebellum. So when you have to solve a puzzle or identify an object, something that requires space, your cerebellum is also activated. Timekeeping. So in PET scan studies, when a person is required to determine the amount of time elapsed between like point A and point B, the cerebellum is highly activated. So with counting and predicting time, that's the cerebellum's job. Also, it has linguistic roles in that it helps us interpret and hear things. So it helps us distinguish between similar sounding words. And finally, there's an emotional aspect and planning. So people with damage to the cerebellum have problems planning and paying attention to things. And kids with ADHD have smaller cerebellums on average. So the cerebellum has many, many, many important roles, not just about balance and posture. Next up, we have the Diencephalon. And the Diencephalon connects the cerebrum to the rest of the brain. So it lies between the brainstem and the cerebrum. And there are three major structures within the Diencephalon. We have two thalami. So we have the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the pineal gland, or the epithalamus. So this diencephalon is in the middle of the brain, not to be confused with the midbrain. The diencephalon is separate. The diencephalon includes the pineal gland, which is the epithalamus, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. You know, something I didn't mention about the cerebellum was this structure called the arbor vitae. Now that I just noticed that, I wanted to and that's made of white matter. And if we were to do a dissection, that's one of the fun things to look for, is the arbor vitae, because it looks like the tree of life, right? It looks like a tree almost. So now that I'll go back to the diencephalon, we'll talk about the thalamus first. And the thalamus is the relay station, or the gateway to the cerebral cortex. What the thalamus does is it takes any sensory information and it relays it to the right place of the cerebral cortex. It's almost like, I don't even want to say the Golgi, it's almost like the Golgi apparatus in a way. It kind of takes the information and sorts it to where it needs to go within the cerebral cortex. So with the exception of smell, because our sense of smell is direct to the brain. Our olfactory nerve is directly linked to the brain. All of our other senses are linked to the thalamus first. So the thalamus is the first up for the information, and then it will relay that information to where it needs to go in the cerebral cortex. The thalamus also helps relay motor information between brain regions. So in between two brain regions, the thalamus can help integrate that motor information. And we now know the thalamus has a role in memory formation as well. And remember, there are two thalami that are semi-attached by this interthalamic adhesion. And there are sensory portions, there are motor portions, and there are limbic portions. So we said they have roles in memories and emotions, motor information, and sensory information. So we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is up next, part of the diencephalon, and the hypothalamus is known as the unconscious bus driver. Meaning, think about a bus driver. They function without even being conscious of it. They could stop, they could open the door, they're so used to it, they just do it without thinking. So that's what the hypothalamus is kind of doing. The hypothalamus is the major integrator of our autonomic nervous system. So all the things that we're unconscious of, well, not all the things, but many of the things we're unconscious of are controlled by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is also heavily involved in the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the system of hormones that communicates throughout our body. And the hypothalamus can secrete hormones that get circulated throughout our body and communicate with several parts of, or several different organ systems. So the hypothalamus, we said, is the major control center for endocrine and autonomic nervous systems and maintaining homeostasis. So this is what helps us decide fight or flight or rest and digest. So it helps communicate with our adrenal glands to regulate adrenaline. It also helps control our internal organs. So it helps our heart rate and our blood pressure, our GI system to be modal. So it's unconscious regulation of thermoregulation as well. So we have a thermostat called the hypothalamic thermostat. The hypothalamic thermostat is a collection of neurons that monitor our body temperature. And if our body temperature deviates from the set point, then these special neurons in the hypothalamus will activate mechanisms to either raise our body temperature or lower our body temperature. Right? We spoke about that in terms of homeostasis. Also, food and water intake is regulated by the hypothalamus. So hunger, when we're hungry, versus when we're sated, is controlled by the hypothalamus. So our appetite and our thirst is all due to the hypothalamus. Right, and that includes water and salt balance. So if we have too much salt in our blood, the hypothalamus can help communicate with other parts of the body to make us thirsty and get more blood and get more water, which would overall increase our blood pressure and reduce urine output. So the hypothalamus can make what's called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which can work on our kidneys to make sure that we don't urinate out the water and we have enough water in us to balance out the salty blood, so to speak. The hypothalamus also acts on our sex drive in that it helps produce, or not helps produce, but it helps send the right sex hormones. And there's also a role in sleep and circadian rhythm. So the most caudal part of the hypothalamus is part of the reticular formation that helps us know when to fall asleep and when to go and when to wake up. So our circadian rhythm is heavily controlled by the hypothalamus as well. So overall, the hypothalamus is the unconscious stuff, right? Whether we need to eat, whether we need to drink, whether we need to sleep, whether we need to mate, whether we need to shiver or sweat. These are all like basic functions, basic living functions. So the hypothalamus now is known to have roles in also emotions. So aggression and fear versus pleasure and contentment can also be controlled by the hypothalamus. So the last part of the diencephalon is called the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus. So the epithalamus is consisting of the pineal gland and the habenula. The pineal gland is the main portion that produces the hormone melatonin. So the epithalamus, very small, has the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, which helps us sleep when light levels are low. So it produces melatonin when our light levels are low, which can help communicate with the hypothalamus and the reticular formation and put us asleep. And the pineal gland might have some role in regulating the onset of puberty as well. So we said there are three parts to the diencephalon: the epithalamus, which is really the pineal gland. We have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So what part of the brain controls body temperature? So pause here. The answer is D, the hypothalamus. What contains the vasomotor and respiratory centers? So pause here. The answer is C, the medulla oblongata. What contains the pineal gland? Which part of the brain? So pause here. Answer is B, the diencephalon, includes the pineal gland, specifically the epithalamus of the diencephalon. So now we will talk about the largest part of the brain, the part of the brain that's allowing you to watch this lecture and allowing you to study for this test. And most of what makes you you is residing in the cerebrum. It's the largest and perhaps most important part of the brain. This is what gives you your conscious sensory awareness of what's going on. This is what allows you to move when you want to. It's allowing you to write and take notes right now. It helps you retain the information that you're writing down in your notes. It helps you speak and form language. Also helps you regulate your emotional responses. And what makes this a more advanced in humans is the ability to process reason and judgment and planning. So humans have I hate to say that humans are special in any way, but humans have an ability, unlike other organisms to our knowledge, that allows us to reason and plan ahead and solve problems in a more efficient way than other organisms. I'm trying to be safe in how I word this, because other organisms can plan and solve problems too. But the cerebrum, which is most developed in humans and other primates, allow us to do this. And personality traits, like what makes you you and what you believe in, is also part of the cerebrum. So abstract thought, which is very much what beliefs and subjectivity are based on, resides in the cerebrum too. So let's look at the gross anatomy of the cerebrum, and we'll see most prominently that there are two sections that separate the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. So if we were to take a frontal section of the brain, you would see that there's a connector and a space. So the longitudinal fissure is the space, and the corpus callosum is the connector. So that's what you see pretty prominently. And when you look at the surface of the cerebrum, you have a lot of gyri and sulci. And you have the most in humans. And you should think about why that's important. Why do you think we need gyri and sulci? Right? It allows us to fit a lot more neuron, a lot more brain into the cranial cavity. So it actually allows us to increase the surface area threefold. If it were smooth surface, it would have 1/3 as much area and a lot less ability to process information. So a lot of other mammals don't have this folding that humans do. So that's something that is unique to humans. So we can now talk about the different lobes. And it's tricky to just say, oh, this lobe does this and this lobe does that. Different parts of the brain were arbitrarily denoted by these lobes as best as we can study. And we're going to try our best to understand what each lobe does as far as we know. So this class, obviously, is not going to be as in-depth as the chapter goes. And this book chapter is not very in-depth for even how much we know about the brain right now. So you can only imagine how much we have left to learn. You could probably fill multiple textbooks on just the cerebrum and how it functions and all the neural pathways. But for now, I want you to just understand the information I'm presenting in this slideshow. So from a superior view, we can see the longitudinal fissure here. So these are the two hemispheres. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And the frontal lobe is the most rostral part. So we have the frontal lobe. I'm going to go back so you see it over here. Here's the frontal lobe. Right caudal to the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe. This is the most upper part of the brain. And the parietal lobe starts right after the central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus, and that's what marks the start of the parietal lobe, which is over here. So all up here that I'm touching right now is the frontal lobe, and then you go to the parietal lobe over here, which is everything caudal to the central sulcus. And it goes all the way until there's another sulcus called the parieto-occipital sulcus that's only visible on the medial surface. And we'll see that the parietal lobe has a function that's unique from the frontal lobe. And next we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is at the rear of the head. So it's caudal to the parieto-occipital sulcus. And it's right underlying, it's just deep to the occipital bone. So note that all the lobes are named after the cranial bones that protect it. And then finally we have the temporal lobe, which is on the lateral side. There's another sulcus called the lateral sulcus. I don't have a good picture of that here, but this is the lateral sulcus over here that helps separate the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. There's another lobe that you can't see here called the insula. So it's deep, it's right behind here. And we'll see that, you can only see the insula if you cut away at the temporal lobe. But the insula also has some important roles. So these are the structures. And now we'll talk about the functions. So the cerebrum has areas that are sensory, areas that are motor, and areas that are association areas. So what that means is that there are some areas that interpret nerve impulses as sensations, meaning they make us aware of what we're touching or what we're smelling or what we're seeing or hearing. So certain parts of the cerebrum are responsible for interpreting messages that we're getting from our senses. And we have these in many lobes. We then have the primary motor area. So there's a motor function of the cerebrum, and the motor area controls all of our voluntary skeletal muscle movements. So all of those, anytime you want to think about moving a muscle, that's coming from the motor areas of your cerebrum. And these are found in the frontal lobe. It's called the primary motor area. And then we have association areas. And most of the brain are association areas that can interrelate sensory and motor areas. So it could combine the information we receive and then associate that and then tell our body what to do with that information. And overall, the association areas are responsible for cognition, right? Which is the mental processes by which we acquire and use knowledge. Association areas are also where our memories and emotions and personality are stored. And these are arbitrary, again, so we're trying our best here. And this is an image from the book that talks about the functional areas of the cerebrum. And I really think this is a good starting point, so you understand at least the basics of what each area does. And once you understand what each area does, I think it'll become second nature. You'll understand a lot of the types of questions that you'll see on an exam. So take a second to look at each of these boxes and think about how you want to memorize. Think about a mnemonic to memorize some of these functions. And I'll tell you what you need to know most specifically in a bit. We'll go through each lobe and I'll tell you like a cheat sheet. I'll give you, I think on the next slide, it's a cheat sheet. But I want you to look at this now and think about what you think is the most important takeaway for each lobe. So pause here and you should take notes on what you think each lobe's primary function is. Okay, so let's start with the frontal lobe, which extends caudally from the forehead all the way to the central sulcus over here. So this is the frontal lobe, and this is the seat of your consciousness. So this is where all of your abstract thoughts come from, your memories. It has a very large role in foresight, planning, like thinking what you're going to do, what kind of decisions to make, especially in certain social situations. So the frontal lobe helps you decide what's socially appropriate behavior. It helps also produce speech, which again, very, very important. So our mood, memory, and thoughts are controlled by the frontal lobe. And most importantly, or I keep on saying there's really no way to say it's most important, but one very important part of the frontal lobe is this precentral gyrus, which has the ability to control our skeletal muscles. So this is how we control our skeletal muscles in the precentral gyrus, which is part of the frontal lobe. And we'll talk about that in a few slides from here. So we'll talk about the parietal lobe next. The most rostral part of the parietal lobe, right, the part closest to the central sulcus, is called the postcentral gyrus. And this is responsible for perceiving sensations. So this is how we perceive sensations. And again, I'll talk about that in a few slides. But the parietal lobe also has roles in processing other information. So you can remember P, parietal, for processing. So it helps visual processing, spatial processing, and also language processing. It also helps us count, like get an idea of how many things are before our eyes. So perception and processing are done by the parietal lobe. Perception and processing. And there's a minor role in taste as well. Something that has similar functions to the parietal lobe, it's a little tricky, but the insula, which is behind the temporal lobe, also has a role in taste and pain, like the parietal lobe. We now have the occipital lobe, which is at the rear of the head, and this is the principal visual center of the brain. This is where we first become aware of any visual stimulus before us, and that information will then be sent to the frontal lobe to make sense of what we're seeing. But the occipital lobe is where we first process visual information and we're first aware of seeing something. Finally, the temporal lobe over here is most concerned with hearing, smell, and emotional learning. It's like emotions and learning. So we have hearing. It's easy to remember because it's right by the ear. So the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, but also the olfactory centers are found in the temporal lobe. And we're going to see that there's some emotional and learning aspects of the temporal lobe as well. There's the one other thing I want you to know about the temporal lobe is memory formation. So this is what allows us to first internalize a memory and to consolidate that, to store them. So this is when you're hearing something, it helps you, the temporal lobe helps you remember language. It helps you remember what I just said as you're speaking. But it also helps form long-term memories. We'll see that the hippocampus, which is a different part of the limbic system, also has a role in memory formation. But as far as consolidating memories and verbal memory, things that you just hear and just, you're just hearing something or just see something, that's the temporal lobe is processing that. And again, there's a lot of overlap. That's why it's tricky, because you see, multiple places are involved with perception of senses. So it's a combined effort of the different areas of the cerebrum and how they all connect via the thalamus. So this is a good cheat sheet of what I just said. And a special part of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex. So it covers the anterior part of the frontal lobe. And the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, controls our executive functions. Our executive functions. And our executive functions are our abilities to differentiate among good and bad, to differentiate among different activities and different thoughts. So you can think about the executive function is, what should we do next? What is the best action? What will this action do in the future? Like, what are the consequences of this action? So judgment and differentiating amongst possible actions, like possible and possible consequences, is all mediated by the PFC. It also helps us work toward a defined goal. So it helps you with planning, right? It helps you execute a goal, so executive functions, and it has a role in social skills as well. These are some important parts. You don't have to know this, but the dorsolateral PFC and the ventromedial PFC are very important for consciousness, and there's a role in mindfulness as well. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next recorded lecture. And a fun fact is the prefrontal cortex is usually underdeveloped until mid-20s. So as we age, we actually do anatomically become better equipped to differentiate amongst good and bad and to predict the future consequences of current activities. So this is a combination of everything we spoke about so far that kind of mentions the anatomical parts of the brain, but also the functional parts of the brain. And here are a few questions. So which labeled region is responsible for the awareness of visual stimuli? So you could pause here. The answer is D, the occipital lobe. Which labeled region is responsible for interpreting auditory stimuli and also storing memories? So pause here. The answer is C, the temporal lobe. Which labeled region controls social judgments and decision making? So you could pause here. The answer is A, the frontal lobe. Okay, so now I've told you about the post-central gyrus, was the most rostral part of the parietal lobe. That's what's shown in blue here. And we said the parietal lobe has a role in perception and processing of sensory information. So I want to explain what that means now. We have sensory receptors, sensory neurons throughout our body that end up going through our spinal nerves to the spinal cord and then to the thalamus. The thalamus, which would be somewhere in here, the thalamus then decides and routes the particular sensation to the right portion of the sensory cortex, where we can perceive that and process it. So the part, I'll say that one more time about what we're doing in the somatosensory cortex. So different parts of the body, from our legs to our arms, our hands, our eyes, have sensory receptors. We have receptors based on pain and position and touch. And all of these receptors from the body end up merging into spinal nerves, which converge on the spinal cord, which connects to the thalamus, right, through the brainstem. And then from the thalamus, those neurons from throughout the body are routed to a specific location on the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And this is a homunculus, meaning a little man. And this, I want you to take a second actually. Why do you think this man is drawn this way? So the parts of the body are drawn um, that are, the size is relative to the amount of neurons that synapse in our sensory cortex. So we have, let's look over here. We have the hand, fingers, and thumb take a large portion, right? Look how big his fingers and thumbs are. And that's because a very significant portion of the somatosensory cortex is responsible for perceiving touch in our fingers, right? We're very sensitive in our fingers. So we have a large portion of the somatosensory cortex that's responsible for perceiving signals from our hands. So if we hurt ourselves or we position ourselves a certain way on our hands, right, we have a lot of nerves, a lot of receptors that will synapse eventually to the sensory cortex at these specific locations. So these were mapped, these specific locations on the somatosensory cortex of where they perceive information from. So the somatosensory cortex is responsible for processing all somatic sensations from throughout the body, whether it's something we touch or something that's pain or temperature. And then they'll go to the thalamus and then to the somatosensory cortex at one of these places. Just rostral. So in blue was the somatosensory cortex. In red, the precentral gyrus, which is part of the frontal lobe, is called the motor cortex. The motor cortex is part of the frontal lobe, the precentral gyrus, and this is where all of our voluntary movements come from. So these motor neurons, these are neurons that will communicate through the spinal cord and control the execution of voluntary movement. So these neurons over here will go to these corresponding places in the body. So let me just say, so over here, let's say you're taking notes right here. Let's use the example of the hand. So this part of this frontal lobe is responsible, we said, for voluntary muscle movement. And this part specifically is responsible for voluntarily moving your wrist, hand, fingers, and thumb. So this part over here of the motor cortex. So what happens is regions of this part of the cortex are connected with motor neurons in your fingers and your wrist and your hand. So when you think about moving your fingers, these neurons are going through the spinal cord, through spinal nerves that control your fingers and are helping you move. If you were to then prick your finger, then a sensory neuron would go back through the spinal cord and trigger, will light something up, will trigger action potentials over here in the somatosensory cortex. So what I can do is, if I were to stimulate this region of the brain over here, of the parietal cortex, of the somatosensory cortex, you would feel as if something were really on your fingers. Where if I could stimulate this part of the motor cortex, I can make you move your muscles, move your fingers. So it's a little complicated, but this is what helps control the motor portion, motor voluntary movements, and then our sensory perception, so this is the parietal lobe, and this is the frontal lobe. Next, we'll talk about the limbic system, and the limbic system is several interconnected parts of the brain that are responsible for emotions and learning. So the limbic system includes the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the cerebrum, really, right? We said that was executive functions. And also parts of the Diencephalon, like the thalamus and hypothalamus and mammillary bodies, which are shown right over here. These are two little protrusions right by the optic chiasm, by the thalamus. Also, the hippocampus and the amygdala are part of the limbic system. So this is all involved in emotion and learning. You can see over here, this is the cingulate gyrus. That's the most prominent portion of the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in learning and the formation of new memories, and also our emotions and our emotional response. So part of the limbic system is called the hippocampus, which is the memorization center, and it organizes our sensory experiences and our cognitive experiences into a unified long-term memory. So our hippocampus, as well as our temporal lobe, are involved in memory formation. So what the hippocampus does is it will organize sensory information and an experience you're having. It will kind of combine them all together and then send them to the temporal lobe for long-term storage. And the temporal lobe is where all of your long-term memories would be stored. And the hippocampus can then retrieve that information as needed. And the hippocampus is named after a seahorse because of its shape. So this is the hippocampus. That's an actual hippocampus. It looked like a seahorse to whoever discovered it, and they named it after that. So it's the memorization center. Next, we have the amygdala. The amygdala, it's like an almond-shaped structure by the hippocampus. And the amygdala plays a role in learning, memory, and emotional regulation. So emotional regulation. So this amygdala is what detects danger and coordinates the fight or flight response. So the amygdala is one of the first to receive any startling information. And so amygdala gets priority in a way, and this can be good or bad. So what happens is information from the ears and eyes go to the reticular formation, which then go to the thalamus and then the amygdala before it can go to the cerebral cortex. So what I'm saying is, if you hear something loud or you see something scary, that information goes to your reticular formation, thalamus, amygdala, before you're even consciously aware of what it is you're scared of. So the cerebral cortex is the last to find out that information, right? It goes brainstem, thalamus, amygdala, then cortex. So if a bear or a wolf is chasing you, that's a great advantage, because chances are you'll start running before you can even think about why you're running. But if you're trying to overcome a fear or an anxiety you have, you're literally trying to rewire your deepest instincts that are at the center of your brain, right? Our amygdala becomes so trained to initiate a fear response in response to a stimulus before the cortex can even rationalize whether that fear is worthy of getting anxious about. So we have to almost rewire our brain in this respect, because the amygdala is wired to react. So we have to use reason and say, oh, maybe we don't have to react that way. Next up, we have a group of neuronal clumps called the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. And a nucleus is a collection of neurons. It's a clump of neurons. And these are at the base of the forebrain on both sides of the thalamus. So the basal ganglia are groups of neurons. They have so many different functions. And what I really want you to understand is that they're interconnected with multiple parts of the brain. So the basal ganglia interconnect the cerebral cortex with the diencephalon, with the brainstem. And it also helps connect to the cerebellum. So it connects with all parts of the brain, the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia have a role in dopamine and producing dopamine and emotions and also habit formation. There's also a hypothesis that the basal ganglia helps us decide which of several possible behaviors to execute at a specific time. So that's how it's linked to emotions and voluntary behaviors. Dysfunctional basal ganglia are found in patients with OCD, Tourette's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and other neurodegenerative diseases. So we're just starting to learn how important the basal ganglia are. But there are so many disorders that result from dysfunctional basal ganglia. That's how we know how important they are. And interestingly, a number of different drugs like cocaine or nicotine increase the efficacy of dopamine. And so they act in the basal ganglia. So I wanted to just introduce this theory that's not true. It's very oversimplified. It's called the triune brain hypothesis. And it argues that we have three parts of the brain. We have the lizard brain, which consists of the brainstem and cerebellum. And the lizard brain or the reptilian brain is concerned with autopilot, autonomic functions, right? Like regulating our body systems, making sure we don't overheat, making sure we drink and we eat, making sure that we can fight or fly. So that's the most primitive part of the brain that evolved first. Then we have the mammalian brain, which includes the limbic system. So this was evolved in mammals, and a mammal behavior is known to be a little more complex and emotional than the lizard brain. Right, we have bonding and a lot more social behavior with attachments and habits in mammals. So that was the middle part to evolve in mammals. And then finally, the human brain or the neocortex, right? Neo means new. So the cerebral cortex or the neocortex was the most recent to evolve. And this is where we get our ability for complex language and abstract thought, our imagination, and our consciousness and reasoning. So this is an idea. It could kind of help you understand the hierarchy of brain structures in a way. And again, it's not necessarily true that there's a lizard brain, mammalian brain, and a human brain. But I thought this was an interesting... I thought this was an interesting way to think about these three parts of the brain. So the brain stem, right, it's like the survival state. It's like, am I safe? Right? Do you have shelter? Do you have enough food? Right? Can you survive? Then you have the emotional state, which is part of the limbic brain, the limbic system. And this is saying, am I loved and cared for? Am I protected? Am I safe? In a different way. Right? This is saying, am I safe physically? This is saying, am I emotionally safe? And then the executive state, right, the neocortex, specifically the prefrontal lobes of the cerebral cortex, is saying, what can I learn from this? Right? It's a very human or very primate / human thing. It's like, what can I learn from this? What information can I store from this? So it's a very mammalian, I shouldn't say primate because dolphins also have some decision-making ability. So those are mammals as well. So again, it's not very clear-cut, this triune brain hypothesis. It's oversimplified, but it's a nice way to remember the different parts of the brain and the relative hierarchy of those structures. So here is a summary of different brain structures and what they do. It might be a good starting point to make some flashcards. And I want to just talk about quickly about EEG, an electroencephalogram. And these are tests that detect electrical activity in the brain. So you can use these to study normal brain function, such as sleep and consciousness, but it can also help diagnose degenerative brain disease or a brain tumor or some kind of brain trauma. And there are different kinds of brain waves that you can measure. The book, I think, goes into a little more detail about that. But the basic idea is that electrodes are attached to the scalp at specific locations because different parts of the brain have different types of waves. And you can read these wave patterns, you're going to read the electrical activity, and you can help deduce what's going on. Is that person thinking? Is that person sleeping? Is the person scared? Are they thinking about a math problem? So by reading an EEG, you can help interpret which parts of the brain are working and what they're actually doing. Mood disorders, such as depression, are likely a result of the malfunction of blank. So pause here. And the answer would be the limbic system. And this is an oversimplification as well. And you can answer this question as well if you're interested. And I'd like you to watch this overview, this video, which is included in the PowerPoint. This talks about the different parts of the brain and what they do. And as always, a good review would be to watch the crash course on the brain. So making sure you understand how to label the brain, how to denote the different functional areas of the brain, and thinking about what would happen if this part of the brain were damaged. So there's a question like that on the Connect homework. So that's a good way to think about not only how the brain functions, but what would happen if it were to dysfunction. So that is all for this chapter, for chapter 14. And the next slideshow will be based on chapters 13 and 15, just select concepts. And that is it for now.